I want to talk today about the issues with God being omniscient or all-knowing, the all-seeing eye in the sky. There's some obvious issues like all the things he clearly doesn't know when we look at the scriptures, and we'll talk about some of that, but I want to come at this from a bit of a different angle. We recognize in almost every aspect of our lives that constant surveillance is harmful, invasive, and downright creepy. We cringe at the idea of governments or tech companies tracking our every move. We pass laws to protect our privacy from overreach. We know intuitively that being watched all the time encroaches on our freedom. It creates anxiety and changes the way we act. And yet, somehow, this very same act, when it comes to God, this very same quality, total omniscience, is seen as not only acceptable, but beneficial, or as a virtue. So in this video, I want to explore that paradox. Why do we reject this all-seeing eye when it comes to our companies and our governments? Even in our parenting styles, we know to avoid this. How does this constant divine surveillance affect the way believers think and act and live? And most importantly, is this really the sign of a loving God? Or is it a form of cosmic control that we've been conditioned to accept? I'm really excited to dive into this today. Here's our agenda. And like always, I want to paint the biblical case for it first. We'll go through some quickly here. Psalm 139, 1-4 says, "O Lord, you have searched me and know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar." Jeremiah 17:10, "I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind to reward each person according to their conduct." Proverbs 15:3, "The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good." Job 34:21, "For his eyes are on the ways of a man, and he sees all his steps." Psalm 33:13-15, "The Lord looks down from heaven. He sees all the children of man. He observes all their deeds." 1 Chronicles 28:9, "For the Lord searches all hearts and understands every plan and thought." Isaiah 29:15, "Woe to those who go to great depths to hide their plans from the Lord, who do their work in darkness and think, 'Who sees us? Who will know?'" Ecclesiastes 12:14, "For God will bring every deed into judgment, every secret thing, whether good or evil." Now, if you're thinking that's the Old Testament, things changed, you would be dead wrong. Matthew 6:4, "And your Father who sees in secret will reward you." Hebrews 4:13, "Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account." Luke 12:2-3, "Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known." And we'll end with Matthew 10:30, one that believers think is so sweet, "But even the hairs of your head are numbered." Not only does he witness these things, but he judges you off these things. He curses or rewards you based off these things. The Bible is clearly warning that you cannot get away from God. There's no depth you can go to. There's no secret you can keep. There's no deed that won't be uncovered. So most of these, I think, have a pretty negative connotation because it's fear-based. Again, when we look at Psalms and Proverbs, the wisdom literature, it all boils down to one thing: fear God and keep his commandments, or else. And the or else is only made impactful by the fact that this God will know every deed you do and every thought you have. So let's move into our next point here to examine that further. Is this a loving thing or a tyrannical thing? Let's explore the loving side first, what many believers are going to interpret God's omniscience to be. I was a believer for 30 years, and again, I saw this as a comfort. That doesn't mean that it was one. That's how I was conditioned to see it. That's how I was raised. Generally, there is a spin where you can make a case that, no, this is God being a watchful observer, a loving observer of your life. Don't you want a God that is personally invested in you, that cares about you, that knew you in the womb, that knows how many hairs are on your head? They might quote something like Psalm 34:15, "The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry." See, Brandon, this is God's goodness in his omniscience. Forget the fact that we had to say they were righteous first before he would be attentive to their cry, or that their cry is probably coming from the last punishment he gave them because he knew their evil deeds, because he was policing their thoughts and punished them accordingly. Forget all that. Look, he's attentive to their cry because he knows. I think many believers, especially people that are lonely or did not get the love, care, attention, or affection from their parents, or maybe they have some issues that prevent them from being more social, etc. God is a great safety net. He is a great warm blanket that you can put on whenever you need to feel not alone. And I don't want to knock that. Britt Hartley and I covered in our conversation, one of the things that you lose with the death of God is this idea of not being alone. Now, I think we compartmentalize in our head when we're not alone. It's like we turn on a switch to make God show up in the room. So yeah, when you're feeling lonely, when you're depressed, when you're hurt, and you can, as a Christian, believe that God is with you in that moment, in that room, you can feel his presence. It's like you have summoned him and are partaking in his omniscience or omnipresence when it's convenient. And I've used this example before, but I think that it just shows so clearly the dissonance in one's head. Let's make him a 14-year-old boy that is filled with anger and angst and hurt, who for this beautiful moment opens his Bible and feels that God is with him, and also that God understands him, that no one else understands him but God does, because he can read his thoughts, he knows his pain, and yet an instant later he'll be watching porn with no concept of this God in the room. You can just turn off that all-knowing. Now, afterwards, one might feel quite guilty because they know somewhere deep down God knows about this. But this is the first inconsistency thread that I want to pull at. Imagine that 14-year-old is in a room with his mom or his dad or his grandma. I would argue there is a 0% chance that he gets his laptop open and just starts watching porn. Do you see the disconnect with this idea? Do you see how Christian believers, and again, this is one example, use any sin for any person of any age in any scenario. They can just have God there when they need him, and then when it's time to sin or when they want to react or when they're going to gossip at that Bible study or whatever they're going to do, they can so easily feel for that moment like he's not there, like he doesn't know. And then maybe they'll be reminded of how God knows everything you do in church on Sunday, and they'll feel guilty and they'll repent for that, and the cycle continues. God's invisible quality plays so much into the psychological phenomenon of believing in God's omniscience or omnipresence, or at least how one believes, how one manifests that. It's almost like it's all just feelings. And many believers choose the pleasant one, because the background fact is that God knows everything, so I'll use that when it benefits me. I won't think about that when I don't really want him to know, and then later I'll deal with the fact that, yeah, he probably did know that. But it'll be a catalyst for me growing. So again, even in the most loving depiction of this omniscience and omnipresence, I think this really fails, because to make it loving, one has to turn it off at times. You don't really want God to know about every thought you have, do you? And that doesn't make you a bad person, but does it make you feel like a bad person? Like you're hiding something from God. Like maybe you're not really the good creation you're supposed to be. And inward spirals the internal shame, guilt, and fear machine. And we're going to talk about that more here in just a minute. And I don't want to go on too hard on this point about benevolent versus tyrannical, but I think, and this is probably just evident, all of the reasons why someone like myself or someone more secular, someone not bought into the religion, not currently reaping the benefits of the warm comfort blanket that is Christ being with you, would say, this looks bad. And all we have to do is compare it to any authoritarian surveillance. Of course, Christopher Hitchens is best known for talking about North Korea when he tries to make this kind of a point, because everyone can get on board and say, we wouldn't want that. We've seen the decline of privacy even here in the States, especially after 9/11. Fear often makes people give up their freedoms. Is that what is happening with God? If he's the ultimate thing or entity that we are to fear, his judgment, his wrath, his justice, then we have no problem. We surrender our consent, our privacy to this higher power. That's what I mean about being conditioned to be okay with this, because what else is there if you're a believer? And also, might as well get on board. Do you see how that sounds like you're under the thumb of tyranny? You can spin it however you want, but one, if they actually believe in the all-seeing eye of God, has to contend then with why they think that's bad in every other scenario in this life. Again, we are constantly making excuses for God's behavior that we wouldn't do for anyone else. I gave 3 examples in my opening. I talked about from a government, I talked about from a big corporation, and I talked about even as a parent. Because we know, no matter which of these it's coming from, that total authoritarian state of surveillance and knowing leads to a lack of autonomy, a lack of freedom. So ingrained in the arguments for God's goodness when we look at things like suffering and evil are the free will he gives his creation. Now, I think free will fails for 1,000 reasons, but not least of which is it really free will with a gun to the head? And adding on to that, a being holding the gun who knows everything you have done and everything you will ever do and every thought you have had and will ever have. Things get pretty dicey pretty quick for this idea of free will. We can see that with Jesus correcting his own Father, God, in Matthew 5:28, where he ups the ante. He does this with many things. In fact, I have a video coming out on it. But in this particular example, he says, "Now it's anyone who looks at a woman with lust has committed adultery in his heart." Thought crime, as if people are actually responsible for their thoughts. It's funny because the Bible catches on to that a little bit. The Bible specifically goes out of its way to say it is not a sin to be tempted, it is a sin to yield to temptation, making this delineation between the initial thought or impulse and the decision to act or not. But not here, not with if you're angry at your brother, which is now tantamount to murder. This is all Sermon on the Mount. This is all Jesus. This is not some old covenant ridiculousness that you can excuse. This is a God who is judging you for every thought and feeling, mind and heart, punishing and rewarding, both in Old and New Testament, loving or tyrannical. That's it covered from the government side with that kind of tyranny. But again, with big corporations, we don't want them knowing this much about us. We want privacy. We don't want that information out there. And it's clear why not. Why wouldn't that apply to God? And as a parent, isn't God supposed to be the loving father? Even the strictest, most ridiculous parents in this regard still don't meet the insanity of God's total omniscience. God, again, is supposedly giving us this free will with which he will judge us, and yet hangs over us and influences us, both good and bad, biblically speaking, based off, again, not just actions, but thoughts and feelings. What an impossible scenario for anyone to thrive in. I'll leave that section alone. I really just wanted to point out the hypocrisy between how most people, again, majoring in the majors, feel and believe about this authoritarian overrule that is obviously not beneficial and harmful, that they deny as much as they can in every aspect of their life, but thank God for. To me, all I see is a scared North Korean bowing down to the dictator saying, "Thank you, Supreme Leader." Let's move on quickly because we could do a whole video on this. I can't help but bring up at least a few examples of the inconsistency, biblically speaking, with a God who knows everything. So here's a few. Anytime that God regrets something, like when he made Saul king, or when he regretted making mankind in general, only to do it again, which is already its own completely problematic issue. If you knew a couple who had a kid and it just went horribly and they absolutely hated the kid, what the kid had become, what the kid chose to do, all of the sin they knew the kid was going to continue to commit, so they decided to murder their kid because of how much they regretted having that kid, can you imagine how you would feel about that couple already? But then when they decide, you know what, we're going to have 50 more, you would think to yourself, you're insane. How utterly stupid are you? And yet, at least that couple would have the excuse of, hopefully the next one's better. God regrets his first batch of creation so much that he genocides them all, save for 8 people, with the full knowledge, by the way, that that would happen the first time, and with the knowledge that it would only get worse the second time, and chose to continue. This is maybe one of the most ridiculous things in the entire Bible, and it absolutely contradicts with the idea of him being all-knowing. So yeah, anytime God regrets, anytime that God tests, like this whole thing with Abraham sacrificing his son, an all-knowing God doesn't need to test. He doesn't need to put Isaac through the PTSD of almost being killed by his father. It's ridiculous, and it's actually completely unnecessary if you have an all-knowing God. We shouldn't have a God that changes his mind, and yet we have countless examples of this in the Bible. If you actually know everything, you can't change your mind about something, or you're just a liar. Like in Exodus 32:14, God changes his mind about the punishment he said he was going to do to his people. If you know you're going to change your mind and not do it, don't say it in the first place. If you're saying it just as a tactic, knowing you're going to change your mind, then it's not called changing your mind. But the Bible calls it that. Again, these terms just don't work together. And by the way, I think I'm being really fair here. A lot of times when people talk about this, they'll be like, why did God look for Adam in the garden? An all-knowing or all-present God wouldn't have to look for him. I understand that sometimes in the poetry or the metaphor, or the allegory, whatever you want to describe these things as, God saying, Adam, where are you? Even though he already knows, isn't a contradiction. So I'm not using those examples. But God testing, God regretting, and God changing his mind don't get excused with metaphor. They are fundamentally false under that assumption of omniscience. Now, one that some people have chalked up to being like Adam is actually the story at the beginning of Sodom. In Genesis 18:20 through 21, it says, I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. What? You're supposed to already know. No investigation needed. You're not sure if the outcry that has reached you is accurate? Good to know you would investigate on your own to confirm, but aren't you the God who will later brag about knowing every single deed, thought, and feeling? So you can know of them, you're just not sure of them? That's a huge new problem. So, again, I hope I did that as quick as I would have liked to. We could go on forever, but I'd rather focus on some other parts of the issues with God's omniscience. Let's move into this concept of consent issue. I hit on it a little bit. I want to go a hair deeper. How does God's all-knowing, all-seeing eye work against our consent? Well, even unlike the biggest social media companies that we all shake our fist against, there's some level of control there. One, we don't have to use their platforms. Two, you can theoretically choose to opt out. How genuine or honest are they being with us when we do those things? How much do they do with our data that we don't know about? Do they keep it if we delete it? That's all an issue, but it was our choice to be there in the first place. We did sign something. And again, theoretically, if they are doing what they say they're supposed to do, we have some level of control over this. And yet, there is no way whatsoever to escape God's omniscience. You can't opt out. Issue number one, there's nowhere you can move. There's no cameras you can disconnect. There's no buttons you can click. This is the condition of living. You were created by him, and he will do whatever the hell he wants with you. And you just have to take it. And like the Stockholm syndrome that so many Christians have, you won't just take it, you'll thank him for it and call him good father for it. In terms of the ethics of this, in any ethical system, I don't care what you agree, where you disagree morally, etc., in almost any ethical context, observing or monitoring someone without their knowledge and or their permission is considered a violation of their autonomy. But God's ultimate divine surveillance system starts at birth or before birth, if you believe and misuse the context in Jeremiah, and it never ends, not for 1 second of one day, and no matter what you've done. So there's just no justification from the get-go. This is the thing we hear from believers all the time, the inherent value of the human, because they are made in the image of God. Well, I wonder if God is watched all the time. I wonder if there's some greater being that knows everything that God is thinking. That God already made himself a cheat code. That God can't even be tempted by evil. We're made nothing like this God, even if the story was true. We're made broken, cursed, with a tendency towards sin, supposedly, and an omnipotent, judgy, wrathful ruler that is watching like a hawk inside and outside. The conditions are nowhere near the same, and I think it does depreciate the dignity of his creation in the way that he oversteps with them. Again, if the story were true, this is an internal critique. So, enter the issue with free will. If God knows something is going to happen, does that mean we don't have free will? I think it's a really good question. And if said just like that, I don't think it necessarily follows. I think there's some steps in between that definitely lead to the no free will. And maybe it's semantics and it's not that important to argue, but I'd want to be as precise as possible so we don't leave loopholes for the Christians to excuse their God, which again, they would do for no one else in any other circumstance. An example that the believer will sometimes give here is, if I offer my child pizza or celery, I know they're going to choose pizza, but that didn't mean I made them choose pizza. They had the free will still to choose. I just knew what the choice was going to be. And hey, pretty good argument. But it's a bit of a false comparison because the parent did not build the child fully, did not construct their personality, did not weave together their desires or preferences, did not control for every single outcome on the long causal chain that led the child to that scenario and that preference, but God does. This is where you bring in God's omnipotence, his all-powerfulness. He created us. He created the whole system, and he didn't have to. And he knew where it would lead. If God, before and outside of time, knows about Tom, and he knows the brain he's going to give Tom and how his mind will work. He knows the parents he's going to have Tom be birthed from and their nature and nurture that will influence this child. He knows the circumstances outside of Tom's control that are going to factor into shaping him, even under the pretense of free will. Knowing all of this and knowing Tom will choose to sin or deny God or whatever thing that's going to supposedly justify his burning in hell forever. Zooming all the way back out before time, God still chooses to move forward with this. God is ultimately responsible, not Tom. Tom didn't choose his parents. Tom didn't choose how his brain works. Tom didn't choose what level of evidence would be able to be presented to him or would convince him of a God. Tom didn't get to choose what his belief would do. That's not something one controls, but God did. See, when I think you start adding these layers in, it becomes very clear that God's all-knowing omniscience does rob one of their free will. And if we needed biblical support for this, let's just look to Romans. I mean, there's a whole branch of Christianity, Calvinism, that recognizes this. Romans 8:29 through 30, for those God foreknew, using his omniscience, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. And if you actually believe God is all-powerful and you actually believe God is omniscient, this is, of course, the only outcome you can arrive at with any amount of intellectual honesty. Of course, God chooses who is saved and who is not, because he makes everyone knowing if they will be saved or not. And no one is putting a gun to God's head, forcing him to continue to make these people. If God is 100% sovereign, God is 100% responsible. And even in this verse, it connects his foreknowledge, his omniscience, with the predestination of the souls that will burn in hell or not. Omniscience corrupts, if not eviscerates, free will. Let's move on to our final section though. And here I just want to cover the psychological toll, the actual harm that is done. This has real world consequence for believers. First, I think, is the anxiety of perfection. And I've heard every Christian answer under the sun for this. Oh, we're not called to be perfect. Wrong, by the way. Go and sin no more, Jesus says. In 1 John, if anyone continues to sin, then he is not of the Father. And here's some other verses that point to that. But of course, we also have verses that point to the fallen state of man, like Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We're told that we can't be perfect like Christ was. That's why we need a savior. There's contradictions everywhere, all over the Bible. But one thing is clear. Christians are called not to sin, or at the very least, if you're going to let yourself off the hook as much as possible, to sin less, or to not continue to sin, to not habitually sin. All of these little excuses and terms that the Christian has come up with to make sense of the very fact that they're going to keep sinning. We also know there's consequences for sin, like Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death. When Jesus warns about sin, he says, if your right hand is causing you to sin, cut it off. For it's better to enter the kingdom of heaven with one hand than have both in the pits of hell. And it's supposed to scare you. You're supposed to run from sin. If at least we can agree that Christians should be trying to improve, to not sin. Because if they do, there will be consequences, whether they be natural in this world or eternal ones in the next. Of course, the idea of the consequence giver, not just looking over your shoulder from time to time and checking in on your work, but knowing every single thing you will ever do, say, act, or feel, and judging you accordingly for it, is that many, many, many believers deal with an immense amount of anxiety and guilt and shame. And it starts with the concept that a God who loves them, or who they love, who is perfect, who could never sin, sees their dirty deeds, knows their secret thoughts, is judging their very feelings. Have you ever been a Christian who felt like you offended God? Maybe you actually doubted. You didn't say it out loud. You didn't cause any dissent in the church, but you know you've doubted. Maybe you swore in your head. Maybe you lusted after someone. Maybe you hated someone. Maybe you're in a state of unforgiveness, so much resentment built up towards someone, maybe even rightly so. But Jesus says to love your enemies. Who are you to defy this God? But you can't change this feeling, but you know God's judging you for this feeling. Yeah, that's not going to lead to some horrific, negative, internal outcome. By the way, I'm not advocating that no one should ever be responsible for what they do. I just don't call it sin or good and evil. This isn't some hedonist, do whatever you want, this God is controlling you and that's why it's wrong. No, but I also don't believe people should have to deal with the immense amount of shame, guilt, and fear that they do. And again, I believe that stems from having the creator of the universe peering into your very heart and judging you for it. And by the way, you don't have to take my word for it. We have studies that show that people under a higher level of surveillance or who feel they are being constantly evaluated, and this is especially true for children. We've been able to measure this for what is most beneficial for them to learn and grow and thrive and socially connect, etc. And guess what is never the answer? That total lack of autonomy and privacy, that extreme feeling of constant surveillance and evaluation, right? Because you're not just being watched, you're being judged. Those people, those kids in these different studies developed a tendency towards perfectionism, which is not attainable, and thus anxiety, depression, fear, dread, guilt, leading into shame, feelings of worthlessness or less than, burnout, you name it. Nothing good comes from it. And this is the sick cycle that the believer is in. You're told not to sin. You're told you're a new creation. You're told you have the power, the witness of the Holy Spirit to do better, to be a better example, to help others, to be a shining light. You believe this God is watching you, knowing you. You know your thoughts. You know your feelings. You see the sinful things you do that no one else knows about. And now you know you messed up again. So you get on your knees and you pray and you ask for strength, but you sin again. It keeps happening. Maybe on the outside, it looks like you're doing great. Maybe everyone else sees you for what you want them to see you as, but you've got this internal thing going on with the creator of the universe where you know you're messing up. You know you can't measure up. You know you're letting him down. You're confused about where the Holy Spirit is. You don't know why you're struggling with this addiction. Why do you keep doing the sin you don't want to? Well, even Paul said he did what he didn't want to, and you take some comfort there for a while and you do another devotion and you try harder and you go a month this time without doing whatever that thing is that you didn't want to do, that you don't want God to keep seeing you do. And think about this lifestyle. Think about the harm that is there. You can never arrive in Christianity. You're called to be perfect, but told that you're broken and damned. You're literally cursed not to be able to be perfect. God gave a supernatural enemy whose entire job it is to tempt you on a daily basis, depending on what you believe about spiritual warfare. And you, a mere mortal, you're no match. And for a God that says, do not be anxious, or I did not give you a spirit of fear. We sure have a lot of Christians who have severe anxiety and depression and shame issues. I wonder why. And going back to those studies, what did they all find? Impaired performance. You want students to do better on a SAT? Constant surveillance and evaluation made them do worse. So even for God, who wants his own creation to be set apart, right? The sanctification process, shouldn't he know how this plays on the human psyche? Again, those 6 cycles that I was talking about, those failure loops that people get stuck in when they're under this kind of scrutiny. It's futile. A really powerful analogy for this divine surveillance system that God has going here is the panopticon effect. And essentially it states that people alter their behavior when they believe they are being watched, even if they cannot see their observer. Again, it's why it ties in so good with what believers have going on with God. And my point here is the impact on authenticity or even morality. In terms of authenticity, the suppression of feelings or desires is an insane thing. I'm not saying everyone should act on them, but when you are told that a certain feeling itself is sinful, is of the devil, is demonic, that it is the same thing as doing it. Again, Jesus' examples with anger and murder and lust and adultery. The suppression of those thoughts, those feelings, those desires, or the attempt to suppress, because sometimes you can't control those first thoughts, first instincts, first impulses, leads to a dissonance in your psyche that is psychologically damaging. And of course it is. Do you know how many Christians aren't in touch with their feelings because they're afraid of them? Anger is useful. Doubt and desire and all the other emotions that Christians are told are bad, put them down, suppress them, cage them, etc., have their place, have their time, have their use. And of course, like anything, you can abuse something or not. I'm not saying, again, give in to everything, but come on. nuance. A lot of what deconstruction therapy and counseling is getting people in touch again with their feelings and allowing them to feel these things, working through these traumas, addressing reality because it was suppressed. It was denied. So then who are you? What is your authentic self? Do you even know? Or have you been so critical of yourself? Constructed and curated an identity that was supposed to match to what the biblical accounts tell you. Slowly twisted left and right until you're in a knot trying to fit into the mold of what God expects and demands from you on penalty of the most severe punishment possible. And then what does that say for the authenticity of your morality? This God works with a carrot and a stick. The morality of a 5-year-old. Levers for control. Do this and I'll give you that. Don't you dare do that or I'll do this. When I do good, I don't expect a crown or a jewel or a better mansion or favor or comfort in eternal life. I don't expect that anyone sees me, that anyone is keeping score, that there's some tally. I don't think there's any angels rejoicing. I don't get a warm, fuzzy feeling from God himself encouraging me. I just do it because I value that, because I'm empathetic towards other humans and I know how I feel and I know how they have the potential to feel and I would never want to be the cause of harm and I'd like to help as much as I can. Doesn't mean I'm not selfish, doesn't mean I don't mess up, but when I do, I don't think the creator of the universe saw me and is judging me. I take account, I try to learn from it, I try to improve, and I move on. It's not letting myself off the hook. Letting yourself off the hook is thinking someone died for your sin. So you're not ultimately responsible. Literally, that's the gospel message. You have sinned, you are broken, you deserve to be horrifically punished forever. But someone pure and innocent did what you couldn't and were murdered for it. And now their blood sets you free and you won't pay what you're supposed to. It's unbelievable how completely backwards Christian morality is from what it claims. So again, I think I've made my case here. A God, an all-powerful being, the one person we're supposed to fear, love, respect, and find awe in, is the one who is seeing every secret thought, deed, and action and feeling, judging you for it accordingly. His wrath is imminent. His punishment and consequence are great. It's a flawed system that leads to tyranny, that leads to self-censorship, the lack of authenticity, fear, guilt, shame, all of it. So, if we understand all that, which we do because we avoid it in every other practice of our life, can someone again please explain to me, other than out of sheer fear and thus compliance, we excuse this of the most holy, loving, perfect, just being of all time? Yes, divine omniscience can be comforting, but at what point does that threshold cross over from the benefit of being comforted sometimes for some people to the disbenefit of what it really is? Control. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of different ideas and concepts and opinions by both believers and non-believers. Thanks so much for watching though. I appreciate you being here. I'll see you Tuesday with another takedown, and until then, keep thinking. I'd like to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast and Boris GVI, Jason, Joe, Kitboga, Perry, Rokkit, Shawn, and StrongRex, my Humanist heroes, Imposter, James, Jarrod, Kristi, and Thronus, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, David, Jeff, Jeffrey, Mrs. Webb, Paul, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.